You hear the ships before you see them. The sound travels across water like thunder that won't stop oars beating in rhythm. Wood groaning under impossible weight, voices in a language you don't understand. You're standing on the harbor wall of Eretria, and the horizon has disappeared beneath Persian sails. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Your hands shake as you grip your daughter's wrist, knowing that in hours, maybe minutes, the choice won't be yours to make anymore. Run, and they'll hunt you. Stay, and they'll process you. That's the word you heard from the refugees who fled here before you processed. Like grain or livestock, sorted and shipped to places so distant, they exist only as rumors. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment below and tell me where, because it's still incredible to me that a story this old, this buried, can still make us stop and listen across continents and centuries. This is Greece in 480 BCE, and the Persian king Xerxes has just unleashed the largest invasion force the ancient world has ever seen. We know the names of the battles: Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. We know the heroes, the sacrifices, the speeches carved into stone. But what we don't talk about, what the monuments don't record, are the women. The daughters of Hellas, who didn't die in glorious combat, but who were taken, transported, and erased in a way that Greek culture had no language for. Because Xerxes understood something that pure military conquest could never achieve. To truly defeat a people, you don't just burn their cities, you take their children, you take their future. You take the women who carry both, and you make sure that within 2 generations, there's nothing left to remember. What happened to them wasn't death. Death would have been mercy. Death could be honored, mourned, transformed into meaning. What Xerxes engineered was something the Greeks feared more deeply, a kind of living erasure, where you survive long enough to watch everything you were dissolve into something unrecognizable. And the system that made it possible wasn't chaos or cruelty for its own sake. It was administration. Cold, efficient, perfected over 2 centuries of Persian expansion, refined to the point where suffering could be scheduled, recorded, and optimized like any other imperial resource. The city of Eretria fell in late summer, 480 BCE, after a week of resistance that ended not with glory, but with betrayal. 2 aristocrats opened the gates at night, and by dawn, Persian soldiers moved through the streets with a kind of precision that comes from practice. They didn't rampage. They didn't loot randomly. They separated. Men to one side, women and children to the other. Age groups divided, families pulled apart with bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't rage. This was procedure. Among the women herded toward the harbor was a woman named Thalia, 31 years old, widow of a soldier who'd died on the walls 3 days earlier, mother of 2 daughters aged 14 and 9. She knew what was coming because refugees from other fallen cities had described it in whispers that spread through Eretria like disease. The Persians didn't kill captive populations. They relocated them, transported them to the empire's interior. 2 regions so far from Greece that return wasn't escape, it was fantasy. And there, in workshops and estates and military colonies scattered across territories larger than Greece could imagine, these displaced people would work, breed, and die. Their children raised speaking Persian, thinking Persian, serving Persian interests, with no memory of the homelands their mothers had lost. Thalia's older daughter was beautiful by the standards that mattered to Persian administrators, tall, healthy Greek features that would be considered exotic in Susa or Persepolis. The younger girl was small for her age, quick-minded, the kind of child who learned languages easily. Both traits that bureaucrats evaluating captives would note and assign value to. Thalia understood, with the cold clarity that comes when all other options have been stripped away, that her daughters would be taken from her not because of cruelty, but because of their usefulness. The system that was about to swallow them whole had been designed to extract maximum value from conquered peoples. And that value was calculated differently for different categories of captives. The ships that carried Eretria's survivors, roughly 7,000 people, according to Herodotus, didn't sail directly to one destination. They made stops. At each port, groups were unloaded, processed through local administrative centers, and distributed to labor assignments, military households, or royal workshops based on evaluations that reduced human beings to categories: age, gender, skills, physical condition, temperament. Nobles received different treatment than commoners. Young women different from old. Children different from adults. The Persians had learned that conquered populations left intact, retained identity, passed cultural memory, harbored the possibility of resistance. But populations fragmented, scattered across continental distances, forced to operate in languages and systems foreign to them, these populations dissolved. Their children became Persian, and their grandchildren wouldn't even remember that dissolution had occurred. Thalia and her daughters remained on the ship longer than most. Their destination was Susa, one of Persia's administrative capitals. Located more than 1,500 miles from the Aegean Sea, the voyage took weeks. Below deck, the captive women lived in conditions that prioritized survival over comfort: minimal food, brackish water, no privacy, disease spreading through cramped quarters where bodies pressed together in the summer heat. Some women died before reaching Persia. Their corpses were thrown overboard without ceremony because, in the accounting systems that governed this operation, they were losses to be recorded and deducted from expected productivity, nothing more. When the survivors finally disembarked at Susa, they encountered something more disturbing than violence: bureaucracy functioning with perfect indifference. Persian officials conducted interviews in Greek. The empire employed translators from every conquered region, asking questions that seemed mundane but carried life-altering consequences. Can you read? What skills do you possess? What was your father's occupation? Are you healthy? The answers determined everything. Thalia's older daughter, evaluated and found suitable, was assigned to the royal household system. She was escorted away immediately, toward quarters where she would learn Persian court etiquette, language, and the mannerisms expected of women serving in elite Persian environments. Thalia watched her disappear into a building of plastered brick and cedar beams, and in that moment understood that her daughter had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The younger girl was sent to a wealthy Persian administrator's household as a domestic attendant, young enough to be trained, old enough to be useful. Her quick mind, which Thalia had once been proud of, would now be used to absorb Persian customs, Persian language, Persian identity, until the Greek girl she'd been existed only as a fading memory that even she would eventually doubt. Thalia herself, lacking noble status or specialized skills, was assigned to a massive textile workshop on Susa's outskirts. The workshop employed hundreds of women from across the empire: Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Carians, Phoenicians, Greeks, all displaced, all speaking different languages, all locked into production quotas that had to be met regardless of exhaustion, illness, or despair. The deliberate diversity was part of the design. Women who couldn't communicate easily couldn't organize. Workers who shared no common language, religion, or homeland couldn't build solidarity or resistance networks. The workshop functioned through a kind of enforced isolation, even as hundreds of bodies labored side by side, and that isolation was more effective than chains at ensuring compliance. But the physical labor, brutal as it was, wasn't the worst part. The worst part was time. Days stretching into months, months into years. And Thalia, realizing that her daughters were growing up somewhere in this vast city, absorbing a culture she couldn't access, speaking a language she was learning too slowly, thinking thoughts shaped by Persian tutors and Persian expectations. On rare occasions, she caught glimpses of her younger daughter in the market, accompanying her owner's wife, dressed in Persian clothing, responding to Persian commands with the fluency of someone for whom the language had become natural. The girl saw her mother once across the crowded square. Their eyes met, and for just a moment, Thalia saw something flicker in her daughter's expression recognition. Perhaps her pain, or the terrible guilt of having adapted successfully to the very system that had destroyed her family. Then the moment passed, the girl turned away, and Thalia understood that even if they stood face to face, the distance between them was now unbridgeable. What Xerxes had engineered wasn't a punishment in any traditional sense. It was a conversion process. The Persian Empire had perfected the art of transforming conquered peoples into productive, loyal subjects by targeting the mechanism through which culture reproduces itself, the family. The mother-child bond, the transmission of language and identity across generations. By separating families, relocating mothers far from homelands, and raising their children in Persian environments, the empire could absorb populations without the instability that came from ruling hostile subjects. Greek women taken during Xerxes' invasion were expected to bear children. Those children would be raised Persian, and within 2 generations, Greek ancestry would become a meaningless footnote in administrative records that tracked ethnic origins for bureaucratic purposes but attached no cultural significance to them. This wasn't accidental, it was policy, refined through centuries of imperial expansion and documented in administrative tablets that archaeologists have recovered from Persepolis and Susa. These tablets list rations distributed to workers categorized by ethnic origin. Yana, the Persian term for Greeks, appears repeatedly in records spanning decades after Xerxes' invasion, confirming that Greek women were integrated into long-term labor systems and remained administratively visible as Greeks, even as their cultural identity dissolved. The tablets specify quantities of grain, wine, and oil allocated to different workshops, the numbers of workers by category, sometimes even names, though most are Persian names given to replace Greek ones that officials found difficult to pronounce or record. One tablet fragment from Persepolis, dated to approximately 470 BCE, a decade after Xerxes' invasion, lists rations for women workers in a textile facility. Among them, 30 Yana women, royal workshop, assigned rations of grain. Second quality, 30 Greek women reduced to a line in an accounting ledger, their individual identities erased, their labor quantified, their existence notable only insofar as it required administrative allocation of resources. These women had names once, families, histories. Now they were categories in an imperial supply chain, and their children, if they bore any, would be raised in systems where their mothers. Greek origin meant nothing beyond mild curiosity. The children born to women like Thalia revealed the full genius and horror of Persian strategy. Imagine a boy born in Susa around 475 BCE, to a Greek mother and a Persian father, a soldier or administrator, who'd been assigned the woman as part of his household. This child grows up speaking Persian as his first language. Perhaps his mother whispers Greek words to him at night, teaches him fragments of mythology, clings to small rituals. But everything else in his world is Persian. His father's language, his tutor's lessons, the expectations placed upon him. At age 7, if he shows promise, he enters training programs designed to produce loyal administrators or soldiers for the empire. The instructors don't care that his mother is Greek. They care that he can learn, obey, and eventually serve. By the time this boy reaches adulthood, he is functionally Persian. He may know intellectually that his mother came from Greece, but Greece is an abstraction to him, a place he's never seen, a culture he doesn't understand, a language he barely speaks. His loyalty belongs to the empire that raised him, fed him, trained him, gave him purpose. And if Persian authorities decide to deploy him to Greek territories, should they ever secure permanent control there, he becomes an ideal administrator, someone with Greek blood who can claim kinship with locals, but whose cultural formation guarantees absolute loyalty to Persian interests. He would govern Greeks on behalf of Persia, and he would do it willingly. Seeing no contradiction because the Greece his mother remembered isn't the Greece he believes in. He believes in the empire. Multiply this story by thousands. Across Persian territories, children born to captured Greek women grew into adults who served Persian interests. Some rose to positions of significant authority, others labored in obscurity. But almost none thought of themselves as Greek. The system had succeeded. Within one generation, it converted potential enemies into loyal subjects. Within two, it erased the cultural memory that might have fostered resistance. Greek ancestry became a genealogical detail, interesting perhaps, but politically and culturally meaningless. For the mothers who lived long enough to see this transformation, the psychological cost was devastating beyond measure. Death would have ended their suffering. This didn't end, it evolved. They watched their children drift away, not through rebellion, but through integration. They watched Greek words fade from their children's vocabulary, replaced by Persian phrases that came more naturally. They watched their sons prepare for Persian military service, their daughters marry Persian men and bear Persian children who would carry Greek genetic heritage into futures where it meant nothing. One testimony preserved fragmentarily by later Greek writers describes a woman who returned to Athens in extreme old age, perhaps. 50 years after her capture during the city's evacuation, in 480 BCE, she had been taken to a Persian military colony in Bactria, assigned to an officer's household, and bore him 3 children over the years. Her eldest son showed aptitude in military training and was selected for advanced officer education. This mother faced an impossible choice: help her son succeed in the system that had destroyed her homeland, or try to maintain his Greek identity and risk endangering both of them if her resistance was discovered. She chose her son's survival. She helped him become a decorated Persian officer. She watched him marry a Persian woman. She held grandchildren who barely understood that their grandmother had once been Greek. And then, after her owner died and his heirs freed her in old age, a not uncommon practice when elderly slaves lost their economic value, she made the long journey back to Athens. She arrived in a city she barely recognized, searched for family members who had died decades earlier, and discovered that the Athens she'd carried in memory no longer existed. The city had changed. The people had changed. And she carried with her the knowledge that her children and grandchildren remained in Persia, loyal subjects of the empire, who would raise their own children with no connection to Greece whatsoever. Her testimony is heartbreaking, not because it describes spectacular violence, but because it reveals that there were no good choices. Resistance endangered her children. Cooperation meant participating in the erasure of her own culture. She survived, but survival meant watching everything she'd tried to preserve dissolve anyway. Archaeological evidence confirms what literary sources describe. Persian excavations reveal graves containing individuals with Greek features or Greek-influenced burial goods. But these markers fade with each generation. First-generation captives display clearly Greek customs. Their children adopt blended practices. By the third generation, the burials are indistinguishable from Persian norms. Material culture mirrors the texts, deliberate, systematic, and ultimately successful cultural absorption. What made this fate worse than death was that death could be honored. Greek culture had frameworks for commemorating sacrifice, transforming fallen defenders into legends and moral examples. Thermopylae became eternal precisely because the Spartans died, resisting. But the women taken to Persia could not be honored. Their suffering fit no heroic narrative. Deportation held no glory. Bearing children for Persian men offered no meaning Greek society could dignify. Forced assimilation defied the cultural frameworks through which Greeks understood virtue, sacrifice, and resistance. These women lived in conditions Greek society had no language for. Their survival was interpreted not as endurance, but as contamination. They adapted when Greek values demanded death over adaptation. They compromised when Greek honor required inflexibility. And so they were erased from the structures that preserved memory, excluded from monuments, festivals, and histories celebrating resistance. Those few who returned in old age found themselves marginalized in communities unsettled by women who spoke Persian fluently, who had Persian children, who had lived too long among the enemy to be trusted. This forgetting was deliberate. Greek city-states needed clean narratives of heroes and villains, victories and sacrifices that reinforced civic identity. The women whose children became Persian did not fit. Their stories revealed uncomfortable truths about Greek cities' inability to protect their citizens, so they were pushed into silence, mentioned only briefly as victims, never as complex survivors whose lives reshaped the populations of an empire. Xerxes understood something devastating. Military victories fade, but demographic transformations endure. Greece could repel invasions, yet the women already dispersed across Persia, bearing children who would grow up Persian, represented a quieter, lasting conquest. Even in defeat, Persia absorbed thousands of Greeks whose descendants served imperial interests long after the war. This legacy extends far beyond antiquity. Persia's use of forced migration, demographic manipulation, and cultural absorption became a template repeated throughout history. Empires reshape populations to sustain dominance. The daughters of Hellas, whose children became Persian and whose grandchildren forgot their Greek origins, embodied this silent, generational strategy. Archaeological bones, ration lists naming Iona, women, and rare survivor testimonies revealed tragedies hidden beneath triumphant histories. These women weren't killed, but processed and assimilated. Their endurance, instead of being honored, was framed as failure. Their fate was worse than death because it erased cultural identity across generations, leaving only fragments where their stories should be.